Ricky Morales, a man whose professional life was dictated by monitors, charts, and chemical balances, served the unholy hours of the night shift. At St. Jude's Medical Center, the night was not merely the absence of sun, it was a profound shift in reality. The daytime bustle, the cheerful chaos of visitors, and the rapid-fire beeps of critical care all retreated, leaving the facility to settle into a cold, echoing silence, broken only by the hum of ancient HVAC systems and the distant mechanical wheeze of life support. His posting tonight was the North Wing, a relic of the hospital's past. Staff referred to it as the Annex, or more darkly, the Cold Storage. It was the oldest wing, its layout labyrinthine, its electrical wiring prone to humming fits, and its thick walls rumored to contain more than just asbestos. Reserved for long-term geriatric and palliative care, it was mostly empty. 3 patients, frail, deep sleepers, were all that occupied the 20 available rooms, conveniently clustered near the main nurses' station for security. The rest of the corridor stretched out, 100 feet of abandoned potential, perpetually swallowed by gloom. Ricky was a dedicated skeptic. He attributed all whispered hospital ghost stories to exhaustion, the delirium of severe fever, or simple power surges. He trusted his scientific training. Tonight, however, that training would prove utterly useless. Around 1 a.m., deep into the graveyard shift, the silence cracked. Ricky was meticulously logging vitals, enjoying the peace, when the first anomaly presented itself. A heavy chrome IV pole, the kind used for high-volume transfusions, appeared in the corridor. It had rolled out from room 204, a cavernous, locked supply room at the hallway's absolute terminus. It hadn't just listed lazily, it had moved with purpose. Its heavy rubber wheels made no sound on the polished linoleum, yet it stopped dead center under a harsh, flickering fluorescent bulb. It stood there, upright and utterly centered, an unmistakable metallic sentinel. Ricky's breath hitched. He hadn't heard a whisper of movement. He stood, his neck hairs standing stiffly, his scientific brain scrambling for an explanation. Air pressure differential, he rationalized aloud, though the central AC was silent. He walked a considerable distance, his footsteps sounding unnaturally loud. The air near the end of the corridor was distinct. It wasn't just cool, it was a deep, bone-aching cold that felt manufactured, an internal chill that bypassed his thick navy scrubs and settled into his core. He wheeled the heavy pole back into 204. As he did, he noticed the lock on the door, a simple sliding bolt, was fully retracted, though he was certain maintenance had secured it earlier. He pushed the door hard, hearing the deadbolt click home with an undeniable finality. Back at the station, his heart hammered against his ribs, a persistent internal drumbeat. He tried to focus on his charts, but his eyes kept darting back to the dark mouth of the hallway. At 2:30 a.m., the lights started their siege. The patient call lights flickered on, not from his 3 occupied rooms, but from rooms 210, 211, and 212. These rooms were empty, their beds removed, their surfaces wiped down to a sterile sheen. The orange indicator lights flashed rapidly, not steady pleas for water or pain medication, but a frantic, rapid staccato of alarm. A silent cry for help from rooms that held no life. Ricky grabbed the intercom handset, his voice tight. "North Wing Nurses Station. Who is calling?" Only static greeted him. Then, overlaying the hiss, came a distinct, heavy dragging sound. It wasn't faint. It was a rough tearing noise, like someone in the deep, dark corridor was slowly pulling a massive leaden slab across uncarpeted concrete, a sound utterly impossible in the clean environment of a hospital. It had a deliberate rhythm. Shh. Shh. Ricky snatched his flashlight and raced out. The moment he passed the station's security, the dragging sound ceased. The hall was empty, the flickering call lights casting long, jittery shadows. He approached room 211. Before entering, he heard the noise inside, a rhythmic, metallic tap, tap, tap. It was light, almost playful, yet utterly unnerving. He pushed the door open, flooding the space with light. The room was pristine, but in its center, a bright blue, grapefruit-sized rubber stress ball was bouncing. It was perfectly airborne between bounces, defying gravity, moving vertically without any visible impetus. He watched for 5 seconds of pure disbelief, his professional cynicism crumbling into primal terror. He reached a trembling hand out. As his fingers approached the space below the ball, it instantly dropped, hitting the floor with a final flat thud. He froze. This wasn't a draft. This was a presence reacting to him. He backed out, canceled the 3 flashing lights, and retreated quickly. The dragging sound immediately resumed, now emanating from the supply closet directly behind his station. "I need to call security," he whispered, his grip on the counter bone-white. Before he could reach the phone, the poltergeist escalated from disturbing to dangerous. The steel blanket supply cabinet, bolted to the wall and secured with a heavy magnetic latch, began to vibrate with impossible force. The metal screamed, the contents rattling like dry bones. Ricky threw himself backward as the door blasted open like a spring-loaded trap. Stacks of neatly folded blue blankets were not nudged or spilled. They were violently expelled, scattering across the floor as if kicked by an invisible, enraged entity. The air was now thick with a scent of stale water and ozone, a heavy metallic smell that made his sinuses burn. Next, his charts. The radiology x-rays pinned to the corkboard next to his monitor began to ripple and curl, tearing themselves free of the pushpins. They spun rapidly, catching the sickly fluorescent light before being hurled across the room. They shattered against the wall behind him, the acrylic frame snapping like dry twigs. One image, an ancient, faded chest x-ray, flew with such venom that its sharp corner slapped against Ricky's cheek, leaving a stinging, icy mark before it drifted down. On the negative, the shadow of a human ribcage was visible, but the sternum appeared oddly collapsed, unnaturally thin and long. The sheer, focused malice was undeniable. This was not residual energy. It was a conscious, furious entity directing kinetic energy at him. Ricky snatched his walkie-talkie. The battery was dead, despite his charging routine just an hour before. The spirit was cutting him off. He looked down the hall. The exit sign, a dim red beacon, looked impossibly far. He had to run. He bolted, running past the cluster of occupied rooms, hearing the faint, distant sounds of mechanical breathing from within, praying no one woke to the chaos. As he passed room 204 again, the heavy steel door burst open with a terrible booming noise, missing his shoulder by an inch. He put his head down, pushing toward the junction between the north wing and the main hospital lobby. Just as he reached the swinging double doors, the corridor behind him erupted in a storm of noise. It sounded like 1,000 tiny hammers striking glass. The large round clock above the nurse's station had exploded, sending a fine shower of glass shards onto the plastic desk. Simultaneously, the final inescapable trap was sprung. The defibrillator cart, a heavy stainless steel piece of emergency equipment, rolled out from an alcove near the exit doors. It moved with unnatural speed and purpose, slamming into the double doors Ricky was about to escape through, wedging itself tightly against the frame and locking them shut. He threw his weight against the handles, but the 300-pound cart was immovable, pinned against the doors by a strength no human could possess. Then, the lights truly began to die. Not in a systemic power outage, but individually, the tubes flickering and sputtering into non-existence, starting from the distant end and rapidly racing toward him. The north wing plunged into total blackness, illuminated only by the frantic red slash of the exit sign. And in the profound darkness, the dragging sound was back, right up close, scraping along the floor inches behind his polished work shoes. It stopped at his back, and the air temperature dropped to a flash freeze. A wet, guttural whisper, smelling faintly of sterile gauze and earth, penetrated his ear canal. "You stay with me?" With a surge of pure, desperate terror, Ricky bellowed, throwing his full, screaming weight against the cart. It shifted. He wrenched the handle and managed to force his body sideways through the narrow, grinding gap between the door and the frame. He stumbled out into the blinding, blessed light of the main corridor, falling onto his hands and knees, gasping. He scrambled to his feet and glanced back one final time. The north wing doors were still fractionally ajar. The heavy defibrillator cart, completely silent and perfectly still, slowly and deliberately began to roll backward, disappearing into the suffocating, silent darkness it came from, sealing the horror inside once more. When Ricky finally staggered, drenched in cold sweat, to the security station, his frantic, breathless account was met with professional skepticism. Security officers found the shattered clock, the flung x-rays, the scattered blankets, and the dented defibrillator cart. But their reports concluded that a combination of faulty hydraulics and a minor localized power surge was the likely culprit. The administration's final judgment was acute delusional episode, exacerbated by extreme fatigue. Ricky quit the night shift the next day and transferred to a different facility entirely. He never mentioned the poltergeist again, knowing his sanity would be questioned. But every time he was in a quiet, confined space, he could feel the cold on his skin and hear, faintly, the rough, tearing sound of something heavy being dragged. Ricky had been forced to discard his scientific skepticism for a truth that was far older, far colder, and deeply, irrevocably terrifying. Some things in the dark don't want to be left alone. The hours between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. were Dr. Annie Chen's personal graveyard shift. This was when the hospital's vast machinery of healing and maintenance settled into a deceptive quiet, a heavy, cold stillness that absorbed sound and stretched the shadows until they felt sentient. The low-frequency hum of ventilation and distant life support machines was the only proof of survival in the absolute quiet. A quiet so dense it seemed to press against her eardrums, muffling the world outside her skull. The air itself seemed pressurized, thick with the scent of fear and decay. The smell was the worst then. A cloying, aggressive blend of industrial cleaner, stale coffee, and something medicinal and faintly metallic, like old blood. A residual ghostly odor that never fully dissipated and seemed to cling to the back of her throat. Annie was on her third-floor rounds, checking the geriatric ward, a place notorious not just for its complex cases, but for its deep, echoing silence and the lingering presence of those awaiting their final passage, the long-term stays. She was bone-tired. Her fatigue was not just physical exhaustion, it was a profound sensory dulling, a kind of internal sabotage that made her question the clarity of her own vision and judgment. Her mind, pushed past its limits, began playing tricks, seeing fleeting shapes in the periphery. She hadn't seen her apartment in what felt like a week, and the merciless fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a sickly yellow-green sheen over everything, were starting to strobe behind her eyes, casting momentary, blinding flares. Her only company was the rhythmic squeak of her rubber-soled shoes on the polished linoleum, an echoing accusation in the wide, empty corridor that she should be anywhere else but here, safe and asleep. The heavy clipboard in her hand felt like a relic from another dimension, impossibly burdensome. She paused outside room 314. Mrs. Petrov, a sweet but highly confused patient who often attempted to stack her pillows into elaborate, futile escape routes, was usually awake, murmuring to herself or the walls. Tonight, however, the room was eerily silent. Even the slight tremor of the bed rails was absent. Annie checked the chart, noted stable vitals, a necessary grounding ritual, and moved on. Routine. Routine was the thin, sterile gauze that kept the deeper, irrational darkness and the mounting sense of dread at bay. As she passed room 310, she felt a palpable drop in temperature, sudden and sharp, like walking into a refrigerated unit left ajar. It wasn't just cold. It felt like all the thermal energy had been vacuumed out of the space. She shivered violently, blaming the faulty air conditioning that perennially plagued this desolate wing. The corridor here was particularly dim, the ceiling fixture above the nurse's station flickering with a lazy, intermittent indifference that turned the scene into a low-budget horror film. A perfect habitat for bad things to breed. Then, she reached room 308. This room belonged to a patient identified only as EV on the laminated chart she held. Eleanor Vance. She was one of the oldest residents, brought in weeks ago following a severe fall, but her official diagnosis was a slow, systemic failure, a final, peaceful surrender that doctors had expected weeks ago. She rarely spoke, merely watched the wall with eyes that seemed to be the color of stagnant water, reflecting nothing but the dim light from the window, yet somehow seeming to track invisible movement in the empty space above her. They held centuries of forgotten knowledge and a patience that unnerved every nurse who attended her, often whispering that Mrs. Vance was already halfway out the door. Annie's fingers tightened on the clipboard until her knuckles were white, seeking the solid reality of the plastic. The door to room 308 was not fully closed. It was ajar by perhaps an inch, casting a thin vertical slice of dense, absolute darkness onto the carpet. Usually, the doors were kept securely latched, both for patient safety and privacy. This small deviation was enough to set her teeth on edge. She gently pushed the door open, allowing the faint, unreliable light from the hallway to spill inside. "Mrs. Vance?" Annie whispered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud and brittle in the immense quiet, moving slowly so as not to startle the elderly woman. The room was bathed in pale lunar light, streaming through the single large window overlooking the city's distant, uncaring sprawl. Dust motes danced hypnotically in the silver beam, making the air look thick and disturbed, as if something invisible had recently passed through it. Annie's gaze went immediately to the bed. The bed was made. The sheets were pulled tight, pristine, and perfectly flat across the mattress, forming a perfect white canvas. The sheet was untouched, unwrinkled, as if the bed had been empty for hours. But the patient was not on the mattress. Eleanor Vance was floating. She was suspended in the air, roughly a foot above the starched white sheets. Her body was perfectly horizontal, rigid as a plank of wood, yet impossibly light. This was no ghost's transparency. This was a solid, three-dimensional body, utterly denying the gravitational pull that tethered everything else in the universe to the Earth, defying all known physics and medical logic. Her thin, papery arms lay neatly at her sides. Her sparse white hair was spread out around her head like a halo of frost against the dim moonlight, each strand separate and distinct in the air. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling. They were not the glazed-over eyes of a corpse, nor the twitching eyes of someone in a REM cycle. They were intensely, terrifyingly focused, shimmering slightly in the shadow. There was a look of profound, ancient serenity on her face, the expression of someone finally free from gravity, pain, and the confines of mortality, caught in the very act of ascension, or perhaps interception. Annie froze, her scientific, exhausted mind immediately cycling through hysterical, desperate possibilities. Extreme muscle rigidity, a severe cataleptic state, an optical illusion that her exhausted retinas were creating, or a specialized support rig hidden just out of sight. But there was nothing. No wires, no harnesses, no props. Only Mrs. Vance, suspended, perfectly still in the quiet room, a foot above the plane of the bed. A wave of absolute primal cold washed over Annie, deeper than the draft outside. It was the cold of a deep, watery grave, a soul-deep chill that felt less like temperature and more like the absence of life force. She realized the only sound in the room was the rapid, frantic drumming of her own heart against her ribs, a violent, desperate rhythm in the vacuum of silence. She took a shaky step forward, intending to break the awful spell and check for a pulse, but as her foot landed, the floating woman moved, not dropped, moved. Eleanor Vance's head slowly, deliberately, rotated away from the ceiling and toward Annie. The movement was excruciatingly slow, a biomechanical impossibility that stretched the connective tissue in her neck without a hint of muscular effort, only an awful, patient calculation that felt aimed directly at Annie's soul. Her mouth, a wrinkled seam, opened just enough for a single, rattling breath to escape. It wasn't air that came out, but a sound like dry, rustling leaves scraped across pavement, a whisper that felt ancient and immense, filling the void in the room with cold, vibrating terror. "You shouldn't look," the sound hissed, entirely devoid of pitch, like wind passing over bones in a forgotten crypt. In that instant, the paralysis broke. Annie stumbled backward, dropping her clipboard with a sharp clatter that echoed thunderously in the silence. The noise seemed to violently shatter the unseen, delicate force holding the patient. Mrs. Vance fell. It wasn't a soft descent, nor a gentle settling. It was a sudden, sickening thud as her frail body hit the mattress and bounced once, disturbing the perfectly smooth sheet with a violence that made Annie gasp and taste bile. The sound was not unlike a bag of dry, brittle sticks dropping onto canvas. Annie stood in the doorway, hyperventilating, pressing her back against the cool metal of the frame, seeking a solid reference point. The patient was now lying in the correct position. She forced herself to rush to the bedside, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she reached for the carotid artery. Pulse. Weak, thready, but present. Vitals stable, exactly as the monitor read. The clinical relief of the pulse was instantly overridden by the memory of her upward gaze and the unnatural tilt of her head. She checked the entire room, under the bed, near the window. Nothing. The soul-deep cold was already receding, replaced by the normal, sterile chill of the third floor. Eleanor Vance lay still, her eyes now closed, a peaceful, if unnervingly knowing smile, barely visible on her lips. It was not one of gratitude or comfort, but a thin, almost invisible curve that held a triumphant private joke, as if she had been caught playing a game and the doctor was the loser. Annie left the room without signing the chart, knowing the lie she would have to write, unable to trust her hand not to scrawl levitation under the incident notes. She walked out, not running, but moving with a speed that defied the bone-deep fatigue in her legs. She bypassed the nurse's station, grabbed a cup of scalding coffee, less for warmth and more for the burn, a tangible, real pain to tether her to reality, and retreated to the call room, slamming the door and locking the deadbolt behind her with a desperate final click. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't an illusion. She knew what she had seen, a moment when the veil tore, and she knew that the ancient look in Eleanor Vance's eyes wasn't recognition of her doctor, but recognition of something else. Something Annie had momentarily interrupted, and something that was still waiting in the sterile, whispering darkness of the third floor. She had witnessed a quiet, terrifying exit denied, and the hospital, she realized with bone-deep dread, was not a building. It was a holding pen designed to keep things in, or perhaps keep the wrong things out. The clock above the desk in the nurse's station read 3:14 a.m. In the fluorescent purgatory of St. Jude's, this hour was known as the dead zone, not because of the patients, but because it was when the very air seemed to thin out, leaving only silence and a sense of profound, watchful dread. This was the moment the old hospital, built in an era of bloodletting and crude steel tools, finally felt its age. The quiet pressed in, heavy and absolute, making the low hum of the distant generator sound like a heartbeat fading into flatline. Elena, a veteran nurse whose patients had calcified over 2 decades, tapped her pen against the required requisition form, the soft plastic click sounding deafening. Sarah, fresh out of training and still jumpy whenever a monitor beeped too loudly, nervously wiped down a counter that was already spotless, avoiding Elena's gaze. "Right," Elena sighed, her voice too loud in the quiet. "Mrs. Petrov on 405 needs the arterial line switched. Standard procedure, but the specialty kit we need. It's only stocked in the main surgical annex. Supply room's bare." The urgency was real. Mrs. Petrov was stable now, but her condition was tenuous, and delaying the procedure until the morning shift was too great a risk. The kit was necessary, and necessity, Elena knew, often led to the places sane people avoided. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "The OR wing? Isn't that locked down after midnight? I heard the security cameras in that hall haven't been working right for weeks." "It is," Elena confirmed, fishing a heavy brass key from her pocket. And freezing. "You stay here, kid. I'll be quick." The key felt ancient and cold against her palm, heavier than it should have been. "No," Sarah blurted, then quickly lowered her voice. "No, please, Elena. I'd rather go with you. I still need to log the inventory movements, and 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1 in those massive steel cages." She wasn't fooling Elena. Her fear was palpable, a cold shimmer in the air. Elena gave a small, weary nod. She knew it wasn't about inventory, It was about the stories. Every hospital had them. But St. Jude's, with its century-old foundations and whispers of failed experimental surgeries in the early days, seemed to breed them like mold. The journey to the operating theater wing was a study in desolation. Their shoes squeaked on the linoleum floors of the main corridor, the sound echoing ahead of them, only to be swallowed by the long, deep silence. They passed the shuttered gift shop, the darkened administration offices, and the ICU, where the gentle hiss of ventilators seemed like the breathing of some colossal unseen beast. The air shifted the moment they reached the heavy, unlabeled double doors marked surgical suites, authorized personnel only. It wasn't just colder, but felt denser, carrying a faint metallic tang. Less the scent of sterile cleaner, more the phantom scent of ionized air and iron, like old blood and ozone. Elena unlocked the door and pushed it open just enough for them to slip through. Inside, the main OR corridor was illuminated only by the emergency track lighting, dim, red-tinged circles spaced 20 feet apart, turning the polished gray floor into a disturbing mosaic of light and shadow. The whole wing was held in a state of suspended animation, everything bleached and drained of life under the morbid, infrequent red glow. The specialty closet is in OR3, Elena whispered, her voice instinctively hushed, as if loud noises were a trespass. They moved quickly, their shadows long and distorted on the white walls. The closed doors of the operating theaters, heavy steel slabs with small square windows, looked like the sealed entrances to tombs, holding secrets too profound to ever be uncovered. When they reached OR3, Elena paused. The door was slightly ajar, a gap of maybe 3 inches, enough for a sliver of darkness to spill out. Was this open when we came in? Sarah's breath hitched, her voice a fragile reed. No, Elena murmured, her hand freezing on the doorknob. I secured all these doors before clocking out yesterday, every last one. The realization that the heavy lock had been bypassed, or perhaps hadn't mattered at all, sent a bolt of pure, icy adrenaline through her. A wave of apprehension, heavier and colder than the room, washed over them. Elena slowly leaned in, pressing her face close to the cold steel to peek through the gap. The main theater lights were off, but the space was filled with the weak, residual glow of the external emergency lighting filtering through the door's crack and the high windows. She could make out the shape of the massive overhead surgical lamp, the draped instrument carts, and the long, elevated operating table dominating the center of the room, looking like a waiting sacrificial altar. Then she saw it. It wasn't a person. It was a distortion, a shape, not quite black, but an absolute void that seemed to absorb every stray photon, creating a patch of anti-light so profound that it made the surrounding shadows appear gray by comparison. It was tall and impossibly thin, a wavering column of pure shadow gathered at the far end of the room near the instrument tray. The edges of the shadow did not end. They simply blurred the air, making the steel wall behind it look warped. Sarah let out a small, involuntary whimper as the shadow began to move. It didn't glide, shuffle, or run. It darted. It was an instant transmission from one spot to another, defying physics and light itself. In a fraction of a second, the shadow stretched, becoming momentarily long and thin like a stretched rubber band pulled beyond its breaking point, and flashed across the sterile floor, covering the distance between the instrument cart and the main operating table in a single, unnatural rush. It settled beside the table, appearing to hover several feet above the ground, its indistinct mass slightly shimmering as if viewed through heat rising from an unseen furnace. Elena's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt a primal, cold terror that transcended any ghost story. This was something that shouldn't exist, a tear in the fabric of the hospital's rigid reality, a shadow cast by something far more terrible than any lamp. As they stood paralyzed, rooted to the spot, the shadow raised an arm, or what looked like a long, wickedly pointed protrusion that seemed capable of piercing bone. It moved deliberately to the stainless steel tray next to the table. And then they heard it, a soft, drawn-out scrape, followed by a second, shorter shing sound, the unmistakable, sickening noise of a polished metal instrument. A blade, being dragged across another metal surface. The sound was meticulous, unnervingly focused. It was selecting a tool. Sarah clamped her hands over her mouth, but a small, muffled gasp escaped. At the sound, the shadow paused. Its subtle, heat-like shimmer ceased entirely. It slowly, deliberately, began to turn its featureless column toward the door. Towards them. Elena didn't wait. Years of survival instinct kicked in, overriding the terror. She grabbed Sarah's arm with an iron grip that threatened to bruise. "Run!" she hissed, pulling the younger nurse back and whirling her around. They scrambled, their flight clumsy and desperate, scrambling away from the OR wing. Elena slammed the double door shut and, without stopping, frantically fumbled the heavy brass key into the lock, twisting it hard, feeling the cold resistance of the tumbler turning. The final sharp click of the lock, normally reassuring, now sounded like a starting, peace-tall, firing off a race for their lives. They didn't slow until they reached the main security station, their lungs burning, their chests heaving, the sterile air now tasting like dust and fear. It wasn't a man, Sarah choked out, leaning against a cold wall, tears streaming down her face and gasping for air. It was too fast. It was flat. It was nothing. Elena leaned over, struggling to catch her breath, but her eyes were steady now, wide with residual shock. I know, I saw it. It looked like the memory of a person cut out of the light, a ghost of a surgeon maybe, who forgot how to bleed. They stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence that had returned, now heavier and more menacing than before. Elena finally straightened up, trying to regain her professional composure, even as her hands trembled. "We need the kit," she whispered, the practical duty warring with the blinding horror. "Mrs. Petrov." But before she could finish the thought, a sound came from the end of the long corridor they had just fled, echoing down the empty hall. It wasn't loud, but in the oppressive stillness, it was clearly audible, bouncing off the walls with impossible clarity. It was the sound of the heavy brass key they had used, the one Elena had sworn she put back in her pocket, falling onto the polished linoleum right outside the OR wing doors. They looked at each other, their faces white with the crushing knowledge that the doors were locked from the outside. But the key was now on the inside, and from beyond the sealed doors of the surgical suites, a new sound began, a relentless, steady against the steel of the operating table, as if someone or something was patiently testing the balance and sharpness of a freshly chosen scalpel, waiting for its next incision.